So welcome to week 2. On week 2 we are going to be building a fun thumbnail gallery. So we're going to use images to swap the content of this large stage image by loading the content through the thumbnails. So in the past tutorial, because it was a lot smaller than this one, I showed you how to build it, but I figured I'd save you I don't know, about 45 minutes and have it already built. So I'm going to walk you through what the code does, but I'm not going to make you wait while I build 114 lines of code this time. So when you start this tutorial, you see that everything is already built. Even though you haven't typed or created in JavaScript yourself, the content is already there. The large image will be there, the captions and everything will be there, even though you won't necessarily be playing with them, and the thumbnails will be there. Everything that's created there is created through the CSS and the HTML content. So I have a gallery holding my large source for my image, which is this one, and then I have 5 thumbnails arranged at the bottom of the page right here. Now let's start walking through the JavaScript and what the JavaScript is doing to connect these two. So not only are we connecting the thumbnails, but also the previews and next buttons. So at the top, just like every JavaScript that you've created, we are writing variables, things that we need to keep track of. Of course, I've written a few lines of comments so you can follow along as I'm reading. At the top, the very first thing I'm creating here is a function. I've labeled it change image so that I can keep track of the images that are being changed, for lack of a better term. This function is going to keep track of an event, right? So I'll be creating that event right here. Right here. And I'll explain how the syntax works here in a few seconds. So the first 3 variables that I need to create to keep track of content and also to target content are these 3. So the var image at the top is using the event up here to keep track of a target's source. If I want to see what the source looks like, I only have to look at the image tag. And all image tags have a source, which is the physical address to that image, or the path rather to that image. So that's the first variable that I'm creating, keeping track of the source. Second variable, I have labeled parent, and this is going to keep track of the parent element holding the source of that image. Last but not least, I am targeting not only the ID of gallery, but also the image tag inside of the ID of gallery. So I've labeled that large image, and I know that is this one right here at the top. And if I look at my HTML and I look for gallery, it should be all the way at the top. Here it is. So we have the ID of gallery, and there should be an image inside of it, which I see right here. So I'm using that as a target so I could keep track of what is currently being displayed on this large image. So now that I have my 3 main variables to keep track of all that data, I am setting, remember that everything that's on the right hand side of an equal sign overwrites what's on the left. So in this case, I am setting image to be the source of the large image to change it. Alright, so now we need to change the active indicator. The active indicator is the class of active, right? As you can see here, I am creating a query selector that will return the gallery with active. And if I look at my HTML, so the HTML will actually display it on the opening of the ALI tag. So as we start, that first active class is added to the second one. But you'll notice that if I swap them, if I click on something else, this has the coloration now. Same if I click on any of them, of course. And that's what's telling us what current thumbnail is clicked on and becomes, you know, a little grayed out, so you don't necessarily want to click on it again. That's the active state, and that's being loaded through the CSS. We're using .ClassList.remove to either add or remove whenever we need to the class of active, and that's what gives that coloration. Now we need to create something that will always be listening for an action that gets performed. This is one of my favorite books that I recommend all of you check out. It's called Eloquent.js, and it's a free online book. You can also get a hard book cover if you are like me and you like to read physical books. But it's free online, and what I like about this book is that it has code snippets, and it even has a test page. So while you're reading through the book, they'll give you a few scenarios where they actually ask you to try the code, and they'll take you to a separate page editor and ask you to fill it in just like here. So this is how you build an event listener. Really straightforward. You have a target, the words add event listener, and you could make this a click, hover state, whatever you need. In this case, we're going to be using a click because we don't want to hover. We don't want the hover of a thumbnail to change what's up here. We only want the clicking of an image to change the main stage. So as you can see here on the left-hand side of my JavaScript, I've created a variable labeled thumbnails to keep track of which thumbnail is currently being clicked on. And as in the past demo, I am trying to speed things up by using a for loop, because of course you could write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables, right, and attach whatever you wanted to, like listeners, to each of those, but that defeats the purpose of using a loop and trying to use a lot less syntax and speed things up. So we're going to start 0, of course, increment by 1 each time, and only go as far as the length of thumbnails, which is the variable that I've created right here. If we look at what thumbnails is targeting, .pagination space image. So we already know that that is going to be something with the class of pagination, and then inside of that pagination there should be an image. If I scroll all the way left to my HTML, halfway up we'll see there's an UL with the class of pagination, and inside of it there are 7 LIs, but notice that only the 5 in the middle are actual images. So we're targeting pagination space img. So this is ignoring the first and last LIs because they don't have an img tag inside of it. And we do want that to happen. We want that to be the case because, as you can see, the first LI is the previous button that appears when I hover over the page, and so is the last one, it's the next button. So we want that to be ignored. We don't want that to be targeted for this case because we're dealing with thumbnails, not the buttons themselves yet. Alright, so that's right here where we left off. Now we need to attach that to the thumbnails so that our event actually takes place. So we need to do the same thing we did at the top to refresh that because this loop hasn't taken place at the top. So we need to create these again. Function change image name, change image rather, and the same 3 lines of text for the variables that we created again will replace that. Now when we do large image source and we set that image to the source, the thumbnails will actually work. But without these being done after the loop, you'll see that if I delete that and save, do a page refresh, my thumbnails are not working. So that's why you need it to happen after the loop. So let's save that again, bring that functionality back. There it is. So one more thing we need to take into consideration is that every time that we click on one of these thumbnails, that active class gets removed from the previous one. So this button right here, if I look at my HTML, should have the class of active. So I'm looking for the second li12 class of active, just as expected. And if I look at the JavaScript, what this is doing is, first I'm targeting gallery, pound gallery, so an ID of gallery, and then a class of active, which I just showed you, and I'm removing it. So that happens when I click on an object, on a thumbnail. Next, we need to change via the next button. So this gets a little bit tricky because I need to wrap this function. You can see that there's a little underline under this curly bracket, and this one will go all the way down because I'm wrapping the active indicator, the large image swap, and the next and previous listeners around that. So quite a bit of text here that's wrapped around that. So I have a function labeled next image. Once again, I'm creating that variable thumbnails to keep track of what's currently being selected. As you now know, pagination li are these guys right here. I'll show you that in the HTML. Scroll down a little bit. So I have a class pagination li. And now what I'm doing is establishing where that start point begins. So at the 0 point, at the 1, at the first image and the second image, where's that happening? So I'm keeping track of the active index so that I know which image is currently active. Well, the third one right now, because that has the class of active. If I click on this one, then now this is what's active. But this is how I'm keeping track of how that is going on by adding another listener through a loop to keep track of that. So I'm using a for loop that goes all the length of the array, or the thumbnails actually. Remember that when you have query selector all, it will always return an array. If you didn't, it would only select one item. So I'm going the length of that array with the iterator going up by 1, and so using the class name of active depending on what I click on, which I'll set here in a few lines. Now I need to determine what the next image is. For that I'm using if statements. So if the image is below or after 5 rather, set it to 1, because what we want it to happen is that if I were on this image, which is the 5th one, and I click next, I want that to go to the first one. So if it goes over 5, go ahead and set it to 1. In other words, this is the last image. After that, go back to the first one. So that's what I'm doing right here. If it's over 5, set it to 1. If it's equal to 1, then go ahead and when we click on the next one, set it to 2. So increment by 1, which is what's happening on this last 2 lines. So everything else, increment by 1 as you click on the next image, on the next arrow. Couple more things we need to do before we're done is we need to create a selector that keeps track of which image is currently being selected one more time, because now we need to swap that large image with whatever we click on or wherever we click on here, either through the navigation of the buttons or the thumbnails. So this is what keeps track of what was clicked on and swaps the source of this main image, gallery image, which we now know is this main guy right here. Now, as I told you before, everything on the right hand side of an equal sign will overwrite what's on the left. So after that takes place, I am just simply saying, go ahead and set the image to that source. Couple more things we need to do before we're done is we need to change the active indicator. So if we click on something, that active class needs to be moved to whatever we click on, right? And that's what we're doing here. We're removing the class of active, right? And then we're applying it to the next list item, which has already been calculated by our variables up here, right? One more thing, we need to change the previous because we only did the next. So very same thing we did up the top, it's just repeat of the same code we just wrote. Here we are. So we have the previous up here, and now we're moving on to the next. So very similar, we're adding an event listener, a click listener, which will change the next image created up here, previous and next images. So var next equals document query selector. Without the all, is just going to return a single item, and the pseudo class of last dash of type is just simply going to select the last type of whatever you put to the left. So in this case, last of type is going to select the very last li in that section, which is this guy, the next button. Right? So we have our target established with that variable, and the same thing goes for the previous image. Very similar syntax. So this is all that's required, this 114 lines of code, and now that I preview the image gallery, you can see that the next button will bring it to the next image. If I keep clicking all the way through the last one, it should bring me back to the first one, and if I click back, it should do the same. And you can also see that all the thumbnails are working. So like I have suggested in the past, this is one way of building things. You may or may not find a simpler way to build yours, and of course you don't have as much data on your assignment as I am demonstrating here, but like I said, this is just one way of creating things. I'm eager to see what you guys come up with, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach me on Slack.